Thank you, Yiwen, for your kind introduction, and thank you everybody for coming. It's kind of a funny situation where usually when you're invited to give a talk in a department, you know somebody who knows you, and you have discussions, and so you have a basic understanding of what you expect, like who you encounter in terms of people. I assume you all encounter me for the first time. I encounter you for the first time. So I'll give my presentation, but I hope that in the course of the conversation, in the course of my presentation, and then during the exchanges afterwards, we begin to develop a feeling for one another and for the way that we say things and develop thoughts. So as Yiwen nicely or kindly said, I'm also the founder of LIM. LIM, we try to build an AI model from the perspective of philosophical research. What you see is actually generated with LIM. So that's just a passion project. I at one point felt I have to prove that one can do philosophical R&D and what that means. And I'm very happy to get into that, but that's for a later time. So I'm speaking about consciousness before and after with notes on AI. So the very basic suggestion, I can say the font that you see, like the type of image word that you see, was also AI generated, also with LIM. It was sort of an effort to have a font type that is neither serif nor sans serif, but sort of in between, if you like. So the suggestion is that consciousness is not a timeless truth about humans, but a relatively recent concept. That there was a time, what I called it before, hence consciousness before and after, when neither the concept nor the experience of consciousness was actually known. And of course, if there was a before, there is a chance that there might be an after, a time after the concept of consciousness as we currently know or understand it. I divided my talk into parts. So part one is like the mini introduction. Many, many years ago, when I was a student, I read in a book by Immanuel Wallerstein that the concept of consciousness was only invented in 1694 by John Locke in this book called An Essay Concerning Human Understanding. This is the quote, basically, where the word for the first time appears. We must consider what a person stands for, which I think is a thinking, intelligent being that has reason and reflection and can consider itself as itself, the same thinking thing in different times and places, which it does only by that consciousness which is inseparable from thinking, and as it seems to me, essential to it. It being impossible for anyone to perceive without perceiving that he does perceive. For since consciousness always accompanies thinking, and it is that makes everyone to be what he calls self, and thereby distinguishes himself from all other thinking things. In this alone consists personal identity, i.e. the sameness of a rational being. Self depends on consciousness. Self is that conscious thinking thing. When I first read these sentences, I was maybe in my early 20s, I was like, duh, what else is obvious? But then it sort of slowly, dawned on me that obviously this must have been a new thought in 1619. Probably it was labor to invent these sentences, to convey this. Maybe he did say something that was not obvious at the time, but became obvious over time. And so I got very interested in that, but also I found the whole thing very, very confusing. Why was the word consciousness only invented in the 1690s? But word, instead of consciousness, did people use before? How did they conceptualize them before? Were they conscious but had no word for it, and so on? And then to make it even more confusing, when I first read Locke, the Essay Concerning Human Understanding, I couldn't find the word once. And this was before, in 1990. So this was before I could just go online and do a keyword search or something like that. So I read it again, didn't find it. I went to my professors, they said, yeah, little stupid, Tobias, you read the first edition, the word only appears in the second edition. So I read the second edition, but why did he not need the word consciousness in 1689 when he wrote the first edition, but he needed that word in 1694? What had changed? So were humans not always conscious? The common response to that question is, Of course, Tobias, they were conscious. They just didn't have a word for it, right? And so I'm not sure. Were they? Were they actually conscious? And I think that this common response, of course, they were conscious. They just didn't have a word for it, is unfortunate and misguided. It's unfortunate because it's a naturalization of our concepts today, consciousness, as true and timeless. And then we project that concept onto a time that didn't know this concept. So people could not actually actively think about themselves in terms of that concept when the concept didn't exist, right? So I write nominalism at the bottom because there is this this idea that concepts constitute things, and if you don't have the concept, then you cannot constitute yourself in terms of it. So that rings through this slide. Find this claim that they didn't have the word, but of course were conscious, also misguided because it conceals what I find intellectually very, very interesting. If they didn't have the concept, then how did they or could they understand themselves? What other words, what other conceptualizations of what it means to be human did humans have available for themselves to make sense of themselves? So you see, when I studied philosophy in Tübingen and Heidelberg many years ago, it was history of thought. We learned archaic Greek, classical Greek, Hellenic Greek, Latin, and so on and so forth. And we basically read texts to see, when do concepts emerge? When do verbs or adverbs become nouns? When do nouns become categories? In which sense is that indicative of thought spaces that are changing? So it was not so much semiotics, history of concepts as semiotics, but history of concepts as a succession of logical epistemic spaces. That was with somebody called Rüdiger Bubner. Some of you may or may not know him. Okay, so I began to reconstruct. I just very, very naively read text to understand the before. How did people think about themselves, experience themselves before the concept of consciousness emerged? And I became very curious about what one could call the after. Is it possible, maybe because of AI, that the concept of consciousness, the way that we used it since Locke, no longer holds or must be revised? So as I began that research, it gradually grew on me, or dawned on me, that what I'm doing is that I write the history of the emergence of thought, of the concept of thought and thinking, or the experience of thought. So why do I think that the experience of thought is so important? Remember that quote by Locke that I just showed, a thinking, intelligent thing? The question of thought, who thinks, what is a thought, where do thoughts come from, why do people think, is the core question of Locke. He has to answer that question in a very specific post-Cartesian situation. And so I think that consciousness truly is important to understand that. So odd as it may sound, not only do I think that consciousness is not a thing, but a concept that has not always existed, I also really seriously want to claim that what we call thought or thinking is not obvious, that thinking is not a universal, timeless fact of human life, that there were and still are languages that don't actually have a word for thought or thinking. Archaic Greek doesn't have a word for thought or thinking. So, or for that matter, of mind. So thought, thinking are not givens, but concepts, and probably time and place specific conceptualizations of humans. So this is just a disclaimer. When you say that there is a language without the word thought, you run the risk of implying that you want to say the people of that language are stupid. Nothing's further from me. That's total nonsense. They clearly didn't lack intellectual capabilities. All I want to say is that thought and thinking are specific configurations of humans or of human life, and that others have existed and do exist. Okay. So in what follows, I will basically try to make plausible what I was just making big claims about, and I will do so by focusing on Homer, on Parmenides, on Plato, and on Aristotle, and then I do a big leap from Aristotle to Descartes and Locke, closing with AI. So it's a big tour de force, and I'll skip St. Augustine, which is the beginning of interiority in the West, and Aescipton, Scotus, and William of Ockham, which are very important because that's where nominalism happens and the relation between things and words break. Okay, so what I present is still drafty, still partly confusing to me, and I will need your help in making sense of this stuff. So just before we go into Homer, I want to have this quote, and I will not mention the name correctly. Professor Sun, Jianqiao Sun from Fudan University sent me this in a piece that is not published, and he says, as for pre-Qin or pre-Qin Confucian philosophy, if you take the context in which the 17th century Western philosophy proposed the concept of consciousness and the characteristics of this concept as reference, there is no concept of consciousness in pre-Qin Confucian classics, nor is there a concept that specifically refers to this level of thought. There's nothing that is equivalent. So for me, that is satisfying because it actually helps me think that consciousness might be a region-specific configuration of humans that has no universal validity. I could show similar quotes from Japan. I could show similar quotes from Sanskrit. Atman clearly does not mean consciousness. Okay, good. So let's go into it. Homer. So I want to give you a very concrete example. It's from Odyssey, book 19, where Penelope talks to Odysseus. So I don't know if you all know the Odyssey, maybe you do. Odysseus goes out in the world, comes back after a long time. Everybody assumed that he was already dead. And now he's back in Ithaca and he talks to his wife, Penelope. And basically, Odysseus asks her a very obvious question. Penelope doesn't know that she's talking to Odysseus. She may have some sense, but it's very difficult to actually know if she knows. He, of course, is fully aware of whom he's talking to. And so he asks her, like a husband would, why did you never marry again? And she says, in that situation, Pharos men moi proton in hypnoise phresi daimon. And I leave that in the Greek for a second, which is usually translated, for a god breathed into my mind a thought. So she had a thought, and the thought came from a god. It's just that when you read this sentence, Pharos men moi proton in hypnoise phresi daimon, there is no word for mind, and there's no word for thought. What the sentence actually says is, a shroud, Pharos, first breathed an hypnoise to me, moi, into my phrenes, a daimon. So a daimon, a goddess, breathed the actual shroud into her friend, which is a part of the body that is roughly equivalent to the diaphragm. And so let me explain what the context is, and maybe you don't know what shroud is. It's a weird English word. I didn't know either when I first translated this into English. Laertes is the dad of Odysseus, and Laertes died. And it's the job of the sister-in-law, of the daughter-in-law, to weave a big fabric that covers the dead. This fabric is called a shroud. And so Penelope said to the men who wanted to marry her, I cannot marry before I'm done with the shroud. And so that was her solution. She always kept saying that she still has to weave the shroud. But it's not that a god gave the idea of the shroud to her, it's that the god gave the actual shroud to her, into her friend. So this is quite remarkable. There is no mind, there is no thought, there is no abstraction, there is not an idea of something, it's the actual thing into that body. Okay, so it's not I had an idea, there's no I, there's no ego. It's not I thought, as if thought were an inner mental practice of a plan. It's not even a God gave me the idea. Instead, it's a daimon, put in friend, a pharos, the literal thing. So when you read Homer in Greek, what Homer shows are events happening to someone, in this case, Penelope. Not contents owned by an individual mind that is the free originator of thoughts. Something like that doesn't exist. And in fact, when I say someone, that's a really tricky term, because when we today, at least from a Western perspective, say someone, then we automatically imply this someone is a person with interiority and subjectivity and thinks exactly the way that Locke describes it. But that kind of figure is never present in Homer. and to make it more weird, there is no word in archaic Greek that would have Homer allowed to say something like Locke was saying. Okay, so what we find instead are gods that breathe or inject things into not actual bodies, but into different loci of a body: the diaphragm, the chest, the heart, karos, the liver, the feet, the hands, the mouth, the tongue. Now, make it weird, these loci are autonomous. They're not under control of some human. They're actually often in conflict with one another. Your nous and your thumos might be fighting, and you might be basically you might be the outcome of that fight, which is quite remarkable. Now, of course, you could say, "Oh, Tobias, please don't be silly. These are just metaphors." But how can they be metaphors for something if you don't have another word? If you don't have the actual word? So if you basically say these are just metaphors for thoughts, then archaic Greek would have to have the word thought in order to then describe it poetically or metaphorically, but it didn't, and that's the point. So now, just I grade this out. It's such a cool quote for me. It's not directly relevant, but I want to throw it out there. This is from a book by Bruno Snell called The Discovery of the Mind, Die Entdeckung des Geistes, where he says, the words which Homer employed to speak of the body, Aristarchus was the first to notice that Homer actually doesn't have a word for body. He uses soma, which subsequently came to know body. The word soma, which subsequently came to mean body, is never used by Homer. If it appears, soma means the corpse in archaic Greek, right? So, but then how does Homer actually refer to the body? Well, instead of body, Homer says limbs, guia. It's just that the limbs are autonomous. They're not controlled by the human. The limbs did this, the limbs did that. And that may sound weird, but our limbs sometimes do things without us controlling them. And so I make this whole thing short. The early Greeks did not, either in their language or visual art, grasp the body as a unit. How wild. Now, again, same thing as with consciousness and thought. Tobias, don't be silly. Of course they had a body. I just want to say, hey, let's pause for a moment. Maybe they had physiological existence like we do. Maybe they looked like we do. But how they experienced this physiological system, physiological existence, how they conceptualized it, how they explained it to themselves, was very different from how we explain our physiological existence to ourselves by using the term body. Maybe body is not an obvious something. Maybe body is just a conceptualization. I'm sure you all know this book by Kuriyama, The Expressiveness of the Body, which compares Chinese and ancient Greek conceptions of the body. And it's fascinating to read this because two completely different forms of experiencing themselves. Okay, where in Homer is the I? Where we have an I, a single unified subject that collects experiences into a biography, personal identity of Locke, Homer operates with a different conceptual logic. The human is a more than human site, a site consisting of loci that are somewhat autonomous, loci in which discrete divine manifestations occur. What we call mental activity exists in a sort of distributed field, and this field is distributed across gods and independent loci. So the pharos, the friend, and so on. It exceeds humans and is not under human control. So the concept of a mind as an interior space, or the concept of a thought as such, or the concept of a self that authors these thoughts is not to be found in Homer. Jump that. Consciousness? Really not there, right? Okay, next part, Parmenides. In Parmenides, language for thought begins to appear. The first, it's beautiful that one can observe this actually in English, in the West. Now, maybe many of you know this, that Parmenides invented the noun being. It's a very famous topic in the history of philosophy. To eon is a verb form of being. Like in English, a gerund. Run is a verb, running is a nounified verb, basically, right? So being, nounified verb. And the context in which this happens, you maybe also all know, this are the physiologoi, You know, the typical story that most philosophy students learn is that before the pre-Socratics, before Thales, people believed in myth and so on. And with Thales, people began to ask what the physis of things is. And by asking what the physis of things is, they didn't mean the actual nature of things, but they meant the seed of things. Physis is basically, or phy as a verb root stands for seeds, and the seeds from which things grow. So they basically ask, what is reality made up of? And they had very different answers, very concrete answers: water, earth, fire, air, and so on. And Heraclitus very famously said, no, no, no. On the level of the concrete, everything changes all the time. You can never enter the same river twice. And therefore, there is nothing stable on the level of the concrete. And so that was a big epistemic crisis. And Parmenides had a remarkable answer to that. And the remarkable answer was, when you say trees are green, what is are? When you say this is a tree, what is is? What's the isness of things? There must be something being as such. This tree happens on the level of is. Can we think about that? That was a new question, a new thought. And it was so difficult to articulate in archaic Greek that his language is very awkward, very difficult to read. And he tells, the only text that we have from Parmenides is a proem. Proem is an introduction to a longer poem. We don't quite know the title. It was probably Periphysios. And in the proem, he begins to tell that that he's introduced to a goddess in the sky. Charioteers take him there, and the goddess says to him, I will tell you which are the only paths of inquiry that are for thinking. That's the first time the term emerges. Noemai, the one that is, and that is not possible for it not to be, is the path of persuasion or truth, aletheia. The other that is not, and that is right that it not be. And you go like, not even like, some things are and some things are not. That's weird, that's obvious. But what he's trying to say is basically that if we want to care about truth, then the tree must have a level of isness. This is a tree. What's the isness? It's on the level of is, on the fact that it is. There's some level where this tree must have an abstract quality that I must be able to discover. And it's on that level that I must find the truth. And if there is no isness, then everything is arbitrary. So if I say a tree is green, green must have some level of isness, some level of being that is not found on the level of the abstract, of the concrete. That must be one level up, right? And so being for Parmenides is something like the intelligibility or the possibility of knowing a thing. And thinking, Noin, is the epistemological recognition on the level of thought of this intelligibility. So he pushes this really far. Togar auto noin estinte kai einai, for the same auto thing is thinking, noin, and being einai. So fascinatingly, the word nous, of which I just said that it indicates thinking, already existed in Homer. But in Homer, nous is A, one of these organs, and B, it's basically a form of recognizing that is always linked to something concrete. The situation in a room changes, a tree falls over. It's never the outcome of an internal process where somebody thinks. And so basically what, so this is just an example when Penelope hears from the swineherd Eumaeus, who describes that there is a stranger just arrived in Ithaca. Her nous immediately recognized that this is probably her husband coming back. Okay, so Parmenides literally takes that word noin and purchases it from the level of the concrete things that lead to a recognition, and makes it into an abstract logical operation. So noin is basically the recognition of or access to what cannot not be, being, greenness, and so on, or isness. And that means thinking is constrained by being, or if you will, it's basically being, recognizing being, so to speak, en passant. So from now on, there is a nascent distinction between how things appear and what things actually are. So there's the level of the concrete, where truth cannot be found because everything changes all the time, where you have confusion. And then there's a level of the abstract, where the real isness, the being of things happen. The only thing that has access to that abstraction, to being, is thought. That's where truth is to be found. It's important in Homer. It's not that, like with Plato, a tree has a form, and the table has a form, and the house has a form, and the sea has a form. He doesn't have this multiplication of being. There is only isness. There is only being as such. So how come we know that Noain in Parmenides means thinking? Or, well, it's important to understand that it does not mean private interior thought. It's still a form of recognition, but the recognition is no longer bound to a concrete situation, but to an abstract logical necessity. So it's not a subjective mental activity. It's not psychological introspection. All of the things that are absent in Homer are also still absent in Parmenides. Thinking or knowing appears to be accessing the is by way of a logical operation that has much to do with abstraction. An activity that is impersonal, logical, necessary. It's conveyed by a goddess, not the result of a human. It's almost an ontological function where being discovers itself. Okay. Sorry. Yes, I go to the next part. Plato. Plato is a huge event. He calls Parmenides his father. And, you know, usually people talk about Plato and Socrates. They rarely talk about Plato and Parmenides. But you maybe have read the Parmenides, Plato's dialogue. And in that dialogue, Parmenides meets Socrates and shows Socrates his limits, which is quite remarkable for Plato. Anyway, so Plato gives this nascent word, thinking, noein, a place. And the place is the psyche, the soul. Now, he developed noein, or thought, into a specific cognitive act that he describes as noesis. And it's really important that this is a specific cognitive act. Noesis is, for him, basically linked to the word nous, which at that time means divine mind. Some people have a spark of the divine mind in them, and therefore can practice noesis, which is basically this divine or this metaphysical, let me call it spiritual divine practice, where you think in terms of the divine mind from which the eternal forms probably come. So psyche before Plato was basically the shadow that left you when you died and went over the Hades. It's not developed in Greek as a conceptual term or as a technical term before Plato. So I have a long quote here from Plato. I mean something like this: do sight and hearing have any truth for humans? Or is it the case, as the poets are always telling us, that we neither hear nor see anything accurately? This is important. Think about how Parmenides made the distinction between the abstract and the concrete. On the level of the concrete, truth cannot be found. It's only on the level of the abstract that truth can be found, because that's where being is and where thought must happen. Plato very much enacts this. And yet, if these bodily senses are not accurate or clear, the others hardly are, for they are all inferior to these. Do you think so? Certainly. When then, he said, does the soul touch truth? For whenever it attempts to investigate something with the body, soma, clearly it's deceived by it. Yes, the body is, you speak truly, the body is always deceiving. It stays on the level of the concrete. Then isn't it in reasoning, logistetai, if anywhere that something of being, titon onton, becomes clear to itself? Yes. So it's on the level of thought that and being that truth can be accessed, and you cannot accept, like you see how much this is Parmenides. And surely it reasons best when none of these things, meaning bodily things, trouble it, neither hearing nor sight, nor pain nor any pleasure, but when it is most by itself, dismissing the body, and as far as possible having no contact or association with it, it reaches out toward being, to that which is. So this is Parmenides in action. Now, here's the next quote. So, okay, I'll stay here for a second. It's important to recognize that in Parmenides, we don't know how thinking happens. We don't know how it happens in humans. We don't know where the place of thought is. Here we have the psyche as the place of thought, right? And so he clearly makes a distinction between the body and the soul, and it's on the level of the soul that noesis, seeing basically the divine truth, can happen. So next quote. But when the soul inquires alone by itself, it goes off to what is pure, everlasting, immortal, and unchanging, and being akin, syngonous to these, so the soul is akin to that which is pure, everlasting, immortal, and unchanging. So being akin to these, it stays always with them whenever it is by itself and is able, and it ceases from its wandering, and concerning those things remain always constant and unchanging, since it is in contact with such things. And this condition of the soul is called wisdom. This is really important. Like you could ask Plato, but isn't it a human being that wants to go to this wisdom? And Plato would have to say, oh no. It's actually the nous in the psyche that wants to go there. And you could say, well, if a moth is attracted by light, is it the moth that decides, like consciously, to go to the light or not? And so the psyche in humans is going to wisdom because the nous wants to return home, basically. So what is the psyche? Well, first, the place where thinking happens. And then there's an actual active intellectual principle that strives all by itself, like a moth attracted to light, to search for the truth. Now, syngonous, it is of divine origin, right? That's the part. Now, in Plato, the psyche has 3 parts. One is responsible for hunger, one is responsible from drive, thumos, thumitis, and the third one is the tologistikon, where reason happens. And reason comes in 2 forms, dianoia, that's technical know-how, it's a technical term. Artisans have dianoia, they know how to make things, but they cannot articulate in an abstract theoretical way why they do what they do, according to Plato. And then there is noesis, nous, noein, like this divine spark that is in the psyche. And noesis made conceptually available, possible, a specific mode of, that's why I said Plato invents a specific mode of cognition, which for Plato is the highest form of intellectual apprehension that directly grasps the form. So he invents, quite literally, as one of the first ever, at least in the West, a powerful new conceptual vocabulary for mental activity. And he also invents a life form that is proper to this highest form of intellectual capability, noesis, and that is philosophy. Plato literally invents the concept of philosophy. The word is found once or twice before in Thucydides, Thucydides, in the Peloponnesian War, where he makes fun of the rich and wealthy who now are lovers of wisdom and surround themselves by book and so on. So Plato makes the word into a technical concept. Do Plato's humans think? No, the psyche thinks, insofar as it has part in the divine mind. It's not that the human has the capacity to think, it's the divine spark, so to speak, that thinks in humans. And so what is noesis, what is thinking? It's the soul's dialogue with itself. It's the nous talking to the nous. It's very, very difficult to actually say if Plato's humans have a sense of self. Of course, you know, they will say, I'm the son of so-and-so, this is my mother, this is my father, this is where I'm from, this is my brother, this is my, actually we have almost no references to sisters in Plato, but anyway, this is my sister. And yet, subjective introspection, this was my day, I'm feeling like that, everything is difficult, I had that thought. You don't find that. You just don't find any reference for that. And what's fascinating is, in Plato, you don't think in order to become more yourself, in order to understand your individuality. Thinking happens so that you become impersonal, that you get outside of your human body, physical existence, that you return to the purely objective realm of eternal forms and the nous. Okay, so good. Let's go to Aristotle. Aristotle builds on Plato and on Parmenides. Of course he does, he was Plato's student, but he transforms thinking into an operation with very concrete steps that occur in or by way of the psyche. So where does thinking happen? In the psyche, but now the psyche is no longer something that is radically separate from the body, imprisoned as Plato has it in the body. For Aristotle, the psyche is the form of the body. Without the psyche, is basically the body is an organ without life. So in Plato, the psyche has three parts or faculties. In Aristotle, the psyche has three functions. The triptychon is about nutrition and growth and production. So it's very similar to Plato. Aestheticon is basically touching things, but very important, includes the imagination, as we will see in a second, and the logon echon, which is where reason or thought or nous happens. Now, why can the logon echon think in Aristotle? Well, he's very clear. There is a part of the soul then, which we call nous, again, divine mind. And by nous, I mean that by which the soul, not the human, the soul thinks and judges. And he doesn't call thinking here noesis, he calls it dianoita, dianoitai. Why? Because he's interested in the technicality of how thinking happens. Okay. So Aristotle divides the logon echon, just like Plato divided the to epistemikon, into two principal modes, two different kinds of thinking. The to logistikon, which is for practical reason, that stays on the level of the concrete, of the level of things that are always changing. That would be phronesis or practical wisdom. And then the other one is the to epistemonikon, for theoretical reason, which is concerned with those things that are unchanging and true, which are concerned with nous and where wisdom is possible. So interestingly, Aristotle divides the to epistemikon again into two modes. Theoretical with respect to things, so you think on a theoretical level about things. And the second one is thinking that is purely self-reflective. He calls it noesis, noesios, noesis, thinking, which is quite fascinating. So it's basically when thought is with itself, right? So how does thinking happen in Aristotle? Well, you might all notice you have a sensory input. Your soul builds a phantasmata or an image of this. This image is basically still on the level of the concrete, so it's not yet an abstract intelligible form, and that's basically the level on which the phronesis happens or practical thinking is happening. So practical thinking stays on that level. Theoretical thinking, concerned with unchanging things, has additional steps. So you have the sensory input, an image is formed, phantasmata, that is still completely beholden to the haptic thing that you touched. And then the active nous illuminates, like think of an X-ray. X-rays basically the phantasmata that your aesthesis built and extracts from it a form. The passive nous is given this form and becomes this form. And in this moment, something like a mystical liftoff happens, because in this moment, it's the active form, the passive nous basically becomes identical also with the eternal form, and that's where insight or knowledge happens. And then actual thinking only occurs, because then you're on the level of the abstracts. To make this super concrete, you see many triangles. You build a phantasma, an image of a triangle. The active nous extracts from that triangularity, gives it to the passive nous. Passive nous literally becomes triangularity, becomes identical with the eternal form or first principle triangle, and then you work back down through syllogistic reasoning and you have knowledge. Okay, but we said that there are two kinds of theoretical thinking in Aristotle, one with respect to things like triangles and one with respect to thinking. So in thinking, pure noesis, which he calls cut auto by itself, it does not work. It's basically you have to lift off to the eternal form and you stay there, no working backwards. That's the idea. And when that happens, then you have this moment of bliss. It's pure self-reflexivity. I do think it's very similar to Brahman in Buddhism. So who thinks in Aristotle? Well, the nous. It's distinctively not the human that thinks. In fact, he's very clear. He says, it remains that nous alone enters from outside and is divine alone. So very clearly, nous is a divine element in the psyche. Kai autos esti noemai, And thus there is thinking. Why is there thinking? Well, because the news comes from the outside. Also, thinking is. It is completely independent of humans. It just happens in humans because it already is. And then this famous phrase, absolute bliss, when you're really successful at thinking about thinking, you get into that space of noesis, where basically the news is by itself. And that can be read with respect to Plato, that thinking is the soul in dialogue with itself, right? It's this pure self-reflexivity when you're not thinking about something, but when thinking is basically self-reflectively thinking. So in Aristotle, there is a human self, psyche and soma. This composite human self can think. Why? Because it has an element of nous, of this divine quality inside of it. Qua human, it thinks about things of the world, changing things and unchanging things. The unchanging things require a particular form of thought that is called noesis, that has to sort of get up to the first principles, the archai. So nous enables humans to orient themselves in the physical world, to gain knowledge, to understand things. However, the highest form of human life is pure theoria, and theoria means the human practically dissolves. The nous transcends the composite form, and we become, however brief, divine and purely impersonal. By very brief, because we're still human, we're still mortal. So the nous is inseparable, is separable. It can be separate from the body. It's impassible and unmixed. This nous is separable and impassible and unmixed, and this alone is immortal and eternal. So this is from Book 10, chapter 7 of the Nicomachean Ethics, and it's, I think, incredible statement. But we must not follow those who advise us, being human, that we should only think human thoughts, or being mortal, that we should only think mortal thoughts, stay on basically on the human level. But as far as possible, we should make ourselves immortal and do everything we can to live according to the best thing in us. So it's a little bit as if Aristotle says, what you think makes you you, thought, is actually not you. You have your first principle outside of you. And when you manage to think, thinking, then you stop being human. You left the human realm entirely behind. So compare this just for a second with Locke. My thoughts, I'm the originator of my thoughts. This is my thinking. I'm thinking, think through. This is my interiority. Couldn't be more different. Once thinking is a metaphysical experience, a spiritual practice, and once it's simply human. Okay. So I go to the modern period, to Descartes and Locke, and I want to enter that modern period with this quote by Aristotle, which is just after the section that I just read. For it is not insofar, sorry for the typo, as he is a human being that a person will live in this way, so basically this philosophical way, but insofar as there is something divine present in him. And this divine thing is as superior to the composite thing, body and psyche, as its activity, contemplation, is superior to the activity that accords with the other virtues. So the reason why I have that here is basically that this is just one of those passages where Aristotle says humans have their first principle outside of themselves. Now, here's Descartes. I think, therefore I am. For Aristotle, it is thought is, therefore I can think. Or better, thought is, therefore things are, therefore I can think and understand them. In Descartes, it's I think, therefore things are, as if the fact that things are dependent on me thinking. So in Descartes, humans have their first principle, thought, inside themselves. It's almost a privatization of thought and thinking, right? I find that absolutely fascinating. Like that's really the sort of moment where the modern period starts. So if in Aristotle, sorry, I know you wanted to take a photo. So if in Aristotle, thinking lifts humans above the merely human, that's not the case in Aristotle. In Descartes. In Descartes, thinking doesn't lift us above ourselves. It doesn't result in overcoming the mere composite self. It doesn't result in becoming impersonal. Thinking is a practice through which you become ever more private, ever more personal, ever more individual. thinking becomes in Descartes simply human. Sort of. Why? Well, it's fascinating that Descartes doesn't invent the concept of consciousness. Like you would assume that he would be perfectly suited, but he doesn't. Locke does. But why Locke and not Descartes? Now, Descartes wanted to break so badly with Aristotle. He's clear in his letters that he wanted to break with Aristotle. Yet, Descartes was a Jesuit. He went to La Flèche, which at that time was a new Jesuit college. And the only language he had available to speak about thought, mind, and truth was Aristotelian. So he actually describes the mind as a substantive form. Where does the substantive form come from? Of course, made by God, it's divine. Like every substantive form, it has an essence that it performs all by itself, thinking. He even goes further. He says that many thoughts that we can think, especially mathematical ones or true ones, are already present in the mind when God made it. So in Descartes, to some degree, humans are not actually the free authors of their thought. And if you wonder about how a rationalist can know truth without empirically interacting with the world, well, he can know truth in Descartes because the true ideas are already inside me. So I can feel if it's true or not, which is quite fascinating, right? So I jumped that slide that's just explaining what a substantive form is and so on. Actually, I'll leave that for a second. So Locke and David Hume went bananas over Descartes because like them, like Descartes, Locke and Hume wanted to break with the scholastics. They wanted to break away from the religious clerics. But when you ask Descartes, why can humans think? He said, it's a divine gift. And so Hume goes like, how can you leave the most important question, why can humans think, to a clerical answer? That's impossible. We must separate thinking from this clerical vocabulary. And Locke is just going ahead and is going to do that. Look who's the author of thought in this, to whom thought belongs. Thought is now a private practice. And remember how I said before that in the first edition of the Essay Concerning Human Understanding, consciousness didn't exist as a word, but in the second it appears. So here's the story of how this happened. Apparently, the Earl of Shaftesbury, who was a good friend of John Locke, read the first edition and said to him, well, John, that is all very well, but who's that thing that thinks? Like when you say the divine, you know, like humans are a white piece of paper and we make our haptic experiences and we store memories or ideas in our mind, you say that we investigate then these simple ideas, we make them into more complex ideas. That's how we learn knowledge. And Locke was kind of, oh, the classical answer is the soul, but then I reintroduce religious language and what can I do? And so that's basically where he comes up with the word consciousness. And just to be like super accurate and objective, the word consciousness appears before exactly 4 times, as far as I can tell, in the Leviathan in Thomas Hobbes. But he uses the word in the sense of conscience. So it's precisely basically in the faculty of volition. You know, do you do the right thing or not, and not in the faculty of thought. Okay. So self depends on consciousness. Self is that conscious thinking thing. The other fountain from which experience furnishes the understanding with ideas is the perception of the operation of our own mind within us. This within is very important because it's one of the first times that the word mind is used with respect to explicit interiority. He says, let us then suppose the mind to be, as we say, white paper, void of all characters. This was like no Platonism, no Aristotelianism, no Cartesianism. There is nothing inside me, nothing innate, no prior knowledge, no metaphysics. The acts of the mind wherein it exerts its power over its simple ideas are chiefly these. And actually given the time is advanced, I'll jump that slide. That's basically just him explaining how knowledge is built up. I go to the last section, to the second to last section. So I hope that I could convince you that there is nothing obvious about consciousness. Consciousness is a concept that appears in the 1690s in a hyper-specific context, trying to cut thought and thinking loose from a metaphysical context in which it was from Plato and Aristotle or from Parmenides onward located, and making it an individual interior human practice. Okay. Time-specific. There were times when other concepts and conceptualizations of humans have existed, in Homer or in Plato, Parmenides, Aristotle, in which humans were configured very differently. And there might be times after. So let's go to AI. So, but yes, consciousness is not a perennial question. It's not a hard or soft question. It's simply a modern problem. Already the question, how can matter give rise to consciousness, can only make sense if matter exists independently of mind. But in a divine cosmos, things are what they are because thought is in them. They basically have divine mind in them. Only when you split this, which happens after Galileo's discovery of mechanism, can that be a hard problem. So enter AI. I love to give talks in public places. So for example, in Germany or France, I frequently go to small villages and speak at city halls or town halls. What is AI? You know, just explain what an AI model is and how it works and how to think about it. Almost always among the first couple of questions is somebody shooting up like a rocket. Is AI conscious? And I usually don't answer. I ask back, are you worried about that? And yes, everybody's always worried, right? And so let's just leave it at that. And this is a Google key term search. You see how much the question about is AI conscious goes up from 2012, which I chose because that's when ImageNet happened. So between 2015 and 2026, the number of searches, if AI is conscious, went up 900%. Between 2023, after the introduction of ChatGPT, it went up almost 1200%. The question if AI is conscious is not going to go away. People recognize that AI systems can do things that normally imply interiority, some form of self, and they're wondered if AI is conscious. However, from the perspective of the talk I just gave, that's a projection of a recent European configurations of humans onto AI, one that actually holds on to several modern core assumptions that I think are very important, right? So, as you all know, Descartes made a hardcore distinction between humans and machines. Machines or animal bodies are just matter extended in space, organized in terms of mechanism, fully reducible to mechanism. Humans, however, have reason, interiority, have mind, have consciousness, if you will. But Locke said, well, yeah, Descartes is right, but he made one mistake. Animals have life and machines don't. And therefore, animals have some of the qualities that he says only humans can have. So basically, Locke introduced a triptych between machines, animals, and humans. What is that triptych? Machines, dead matter, pure mechanism. Humans have life. Animals have life and thus haptic, sensuous experiences. He called this sentience, which was a new word at the time. It was introduced by Ralph Cudworth just a few years earlier. Humans, like animals, are more than machines. Like animals, have life and sentience, but unlike animals, have this conscious thing, have consciousness, have basically intelligence, have thought. So humans, animals, machines. Now, ever since Locke, or Descartes, if you will, people in the West operate with this distinction of humans, machines. They're separate things. They belong to different ontological categories. And it comes in many versions. There's organism and mechanism. There is life, being born, growing, individuation. And there's non-life, being built, constructed, staying the same. I could locate creativity here. I could locate the eternal repetition of the same here. I can say nature here and artificial there. Ultimately, I can say these are beings and these are things. And when something has language, when something seems to understand, when something seems to do things or have agentic qualities, then we tend to assume that this is reflective of life and interiority of consciousness, right? So given that AI is a technical system, built like a machine, it would belong into the machine, lifeless mechanism, mere thing boxes. But given that it has qualities that we thought only humans have, or only living things like language and agency, it seems as if it jumped magically out of the machine box, moved over into the sentience or human box and dropped there. And that would be magic. That's confusing to people. They're afraid of that. But you could also say, no, 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 no. Why do you hold on to the either or distinction? It's either a machine or a human. It's either dead or alive. Maybe things can have agency or agentic capabilities and some form of understanding and some form of language without being alive. Maybe AI is an in-between thing. It exists in between the categories that we had. And maybe we didn't need better categories until now, but now we might need better categories and we might need to rethink everything. So if AI has intelligence thought, it must have those other things, life and consciousness and so on too. Well, that's a form of thinking the new in terms of the old. You can also say, if one knows about the contingency of this form, consciousness, or the idea that intelligent operations are indicative of interiority, one could instead ask what AI does to this form. Maybe it sets this form in motion. Maybe there can be thought or thinking without interiority. Maybe there can be thought and thinking without a subject, without life or sentience. Maybe there can be thought or thinking beyond the human. When you think a thought, when you write with AI, where do you end and the AI begin? When you are thinking thoughts that you literally got from AI, you have inside you thoughts or ideas that are of non-human origin. It's quite interesting to think about this. You participate in a field that exceeds the human, that exceeds your humanity, if you will. So where does the human end and the more than human begin? I think that AI has the power to set the whole modern ontology, the distinction between human things, natural things, and technical things in motion. It invites us to completely rethink how we categorize things and how we define what category of thing is capable of. So could it be that AI is reconfiguring the human beyond consciousness, beyond the concept of the human that we inherited from Locke? Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Rees, for the captivating talk. I think it gives me lots of inspirations to reflect about consciousness. I think, of course, we should be yeah, we should be puzzled about whether AIs are conscious, but equally so, I think we should be puzzled about whether we are conscious. I'm getting more conscious of this puzzle after all. So now we are turning to the Q&A section, but before we open the floor to everyone else, I'm honored to introduce 4 of our commentators, one after another. So the first commentator, so we have a lineup of 4 commentators from distinct areas. So they're going to be really exciting interdisciplinary dialogue. And the first commentator is Dr. Ge Jianqiao. Dr. Ge is a brain scientist at the Academy of Advanced Interdisciplinary Studies from Peking University. And her research interests are focused on scientific studies of brain intelligence and social cognition. And I've known Dr. Ge for many years, and she is an excellent interlocutor with our philosophers, and she has lots of insights and ideas, and very look forward to what she has to say about the talk. Yeah.
Thank you for the introduction, and thank you, Dr. Rees, for your very fascinating talk. Yeah, I didn't think I will be the first one to share my comments. So just very drafted thinking. Yeah, I think your talk is very inspiring. Actually, I think in modern brain science, people tend to develop scientific thinking on brain and the relationship between brain and the mind from how to pronounce it, Descartes,
Descartes.
Descartes, yes, based on Descartes, and ignore the peoples before Descartes, and after, and that's also my origins based on Descartes. But after today's talk, I think we who are doing brain science should look far back from Descartes to look at, you know, Plato and Aristotle, and also before even Homer, right? And I want to learn Greek. No. Yeah, I think modern language actually ignore many details from how people develop, how humans develop thinking about ourselves. And I think it's very important because important part of my research is the neural correlates of self and self-consciousness. And from scientific study, we can find that people's concept on themselves is actually highly abstract. So the neural basis or neural correlates of our self-referential thinking is actually in brain areas that is highly developed and is later developed in human. It's not the brain as is in the frontal prefrontal cortex, which is very late developed.
Yes.
So the thought on self is also lately developed. So if you look at young children, we don't have a self-consciousness. We don't pass the mirror self-recognition test, which is like the landmark of how we are aware of ourselves. So young baby, they don't have this clear concept on self-conscious. They will think the mirror, the image in the mirror is another baby. But after like 18 months, we will think, wow, that image is related to myself. We think that image, that reflection is ourselves. But if you think seriously, the babies, they are right. The image is not ourselves. It's just an image, right? So in science, I think people have this trend that what is old is wrong. What is modern, what is new, what is the latest will be the right. So Newton is old, is like an old story, but Einstein, the quantum theory must be correct. So modification, like you have a new phone, the new phone will be better than the old phone. So I think in science, we always think what's new is correct, but what is old is not. But is it true in philosophy or in humans' concept on ourselves? I think we should think about it, because I don't think we are smarter than the ancients, right? Because we share the same brains. The genes on our brain is the same with our ancients. So we have, if we think it in modern computers, we have the same hardware as our ancients. So why should we just be smarter than them? So if you jump outside of that scientific thinking about what's new will be correct, then I think we will get big inspiration from ancient thought on what's mind, what's psyche, what's self. So that's my impressions, very drafted impressions on what you just shared. And I'm totally agree with you. I think artificial intelligence provide humans a very important chance to look back and look again about what human is. And maybe it can help us to reinvent what we think human is.
Yes.
So thank you for your sharing.
That's so kind of you to say. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Reply or
you tell me. So I listened with fascination and interest, and I like what you said at the end, that AI is a sort of philosophical event that can help us, that obviously contradicts how we have been thinking about ourselves and how we have classified things in the world, and it can help this this contradiction is like an opening. It's an opportunity to think again. And I do think that there are differences between humans and AI, but maybe I can articulate it like this. So once upon a time, only humans had intelligence. Everything else was without intelligence and not even stupid. It was not even capable of being stupid, basically, right? And then there is I find that fascinating, like in the history of AI, when you have symbolic AI, that's based on human mind, and the idea that humans have intelligence. What is intelligence? Is having a mind, and so on and so forth. And then you have basically neural networks, and so no, what is intelligence? It's having a nervous system, basically, right? And it's having neurons, and neurons come in many shapes, colors, and forms. Some animals have a central nervous system. Some animals have a distributed nervous system. Some animals have a neocortex, some don't. And we thought birds are very stupid because they have no neocortex. Turns out you can be very intelligent without neocortex. And then actually some neural systems are natural and some are artificial, and they work quite well. And humans are an entry among entries in a series called intelligences. Now, intelligence comes in the plural, and human exceptionalism, the assumption that we are set apart from everything else, is finished. It doesn't mean that humans are not having some special capabilities. So do AI systems, so do bats, so do octopi. And I'm very comfortable with that, reintegrating humans into a series. What I find also very fascinating is the second part that Antonio Damasio was, I once aired, and I got a neurobiology degree, and Damasio was one of the people I worked with, and he always tells me about interoception and exteroception, and how organisms, even bacteria, have some form of interoception, which is a form of self-awareness. It's not consciousness, and so on. But what I find funny and weird is, why do we subject our analysis of biology to a 17th century European concept? How did a consciousness evolve? That's such a weird thing. Why limit biology to that? It's such a narrowing down. Anyway, so thank you so much for your comment.
Okay, if we have more questions, maybe we'll save for later, but for time being, please allow me to introduce our second commentator, Dr. Ma Lei. Dr. Ma is from the National Biomedical Imaging Center of the College of Future Technology from Peking University, and he works at the intersection of artificial intelligence and the life sciences, which is related also to the exploration of the idea of digital life, as well as neural AI, neural simulation, and so on. So, yeah.
So for me, it's quite inspiring, because I always regard AI as the engineering miracle. Well, should I say some engineering efforts that delivered by a lot of computer engineers. So I'm a computer scientist, or should I say I regard myself an engineer. So I think so now your talk actually gave me a totally a different conceptual. So it is more like some philosophy event, and now we probably need to rethink the AI actually bring some new frontiers discussion of the consciousness or intelligence and the human being, what we are, where we go. So for me, it's very, very new, very so I think what I'm doing is actually we're trying to build some life, digital simulation of life in computer. What do we say? Where do we start? We built the first digital C. elegans in computer, which we published. Yeah. So now there's an interesting company in America, which is called Eon Systems. Eon is just the Eon you used in your PPT, and the Eon actually I mean is some metaphor for being, for ancient, for something. And the interesting thing is that they bring a lot of attention recently, because they built the digital Drosophila, and they followed a lot of I can't say a lot, but they follow some principle of my paper, and they give our recognition in there, so I appreciate that. And what is, so I would put this in this way, put the brain and the body and the environment in one simulation loop, and so the digital life we refer to C. elegans or Drosophila or rodent will just move and try to do some random things, and controlled by the brain, also digitally simulated in the computer. So that in that way we can probably try to have a definition of digital life. So probably an initial version of digital life is you can actually simulate where it's from, where it's going, and where it's being. So in digital way. So that in that probably that explain why Elon Musk say we're all human living in a simulation world, perhaps. So I think there's a pure engineering mind, just like me. So we can simulate a C. elegans, by scaling this to a unprecedented level. So we can simulate all human, we can simulate all universe. So where is the consciousness? Where is where is actually the intelligence come from? So now for me it's a mystery. We don't know. So what we try to study is perhaps we can learn some energy efficient information processing ability from the simulation. Like the C. elegans can move and can do a lot of swimming or something. So can we call it intelligence? We don't know. But certainly it's a way to approaching the actual intelligence. So if we can simulate a more advanced animal, so eventually to human. So if we can simulate a human with all the neurons, the biophysical detail neurons in human, we estimate like maybe 15 years or 20 years later, along our technology development. So is that actually the human mind uploaded in the computer? We don't know. So is that can be we call it a digital consciousness? We don't know. So I really love to learn in this discussion. Yeah.
I mean, just as I have my thing here with this. One part of me, so I find this deeply fascinating. If the world's a Turing machine, then your simulations must work. If quantum is right, things are tricky, right? But one of the things is that if you stay on the level of the third person, basically, if you stay on the level of matter and its mechanical organization, there is consciousness or something like this. There is life from a physics perspective. These are just atoms organized in molecules doing things. So I presume that these questions will not be easily solvable through simulations, but understanding biology better, understanding evolution better, understanding the brain better is remarkable. I just want to, I'm deeply fascinated by artificial life. And one reason why I'm fascinated by this is David Ha from Sakana and Ken Stanley from like he built Pig Breeder, is now at Lila AI. And it's this idea that currently existing AI models are trained and then they're closed and determined systems. And when they encounter newness, they cannot go and revise their parameters. Nobody knows how to do that. Maybe there can be meta-learning, but as far as I understand, meta-learning is very expensive and B, doesn't work quite well. So basically imagine, like one typical story is if you have more data, you can have more parameters. And of course, the latent space representations must be refined. And of course, the model must know more things. But my understanding is that at one point, actually, a system reaches homeostasis and you can throw data at it and parameters as you want. It will not grow intellectually, so to speak, anymore. And it's one of the most fascinating things that almost all living organisms are capable of negative feedback. So they have parameters, they encounter environment that requires them to, there's feedback, the environment is different. They can revise their parameters and move on. AI models currently can't do this, and this A-life or open-endedness is basically a form of trying to understand how this could be otherwise, like how can one build models that keep on learning and revising. And this is so counterintuitive because usually when you have a space of possibility and you make it concrete, the space of possibility shrinks. And then you make it more concrete and shrinks more. And at one point it's exhausted. But evolution of living things or of the universe seems to be the exact opposite. With every new species, with every genetic mutation, the space of possibility for new things grow. This is fascinating if one can redo that. I'm excited about AI quite a bit, but open-endedness, this is where I really get excited. So thank you for your comments and your work.
You can go forward. So I will leave my question later.
Sure. Okay. So our third commentator is Dr. Sun Zhong. Yeah, Dr. Sun Zhong is also a scientist from the Institute of Artificial Intelligence and School of Integrated Circuits. And I didn't know Sun Laosh before, but I searched on the internet, and his research area is equally, fascinating. He has been working on resistive memory device and novel computing concepts such as analog computing and in-memory computing, which is very trendy topic. So, please.
Yeah.
Thank you, Tobias. This is my first time attending a philosophy seminar. It's
I'm
strange.
Yes.
It did not solve any of my problems, but create more problems. I do not have comments. I would have questions. So since you, I only noted that the concept of consciousness is what was created in 1690s.
Yeah.
Yeah, which is almost the same age of natural science. By Newton, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I think there must be more relevance between consciousness, between philosophy and the science.
Yes.
And I also noticed that you hold positions or visit positions in Google in Meta. So I believe you had some conversations with these engineers or scientists in these companies.
Yes.
So I would like to know your view on the relevance between consciousness and the computer. Especially, I like to know how do you see, or one question I often ask myself is that can consciousness be understood as a form of computation? Because we're working on computers, we are working on new forms of computers. So consciousness is some people, some scientists may also regard it as a problem of computation. So I would like to know your view on this question. And also, you mentioned that the mortal and the immortal things. I'm working on analog computing, which is also termed as mortal computing by Geoffrey Hinton, who was also a fan in Google and is a Nobel Prize winner. Today's computers are immortal because you can separate algorithms. They say AI models and the hardware, the chips. So without the chips, the algorithms always live, always exist. So this is why people, or why Hinton call it immortal. And we're working on analog computing that combines software, algorithm, and hardware. So it's kind of multi computing, because the algorithm or the software cannot live without the hardware. So when we invent analog computing is to solve the efficiency problems of computers by it is not general purpose, but we can solve AI computations, let's say matrix computations more efficiently. So this was the reason why we are working on it. So we are mentioning mortality or immortality. So the topic for this summit is also about consciousness and its relevance to AI. So how do you view the immortality of AI? That's my questions. Thank you.
Sure. So thank you. This is fascinating, and there are many, so many questions. I'm not like I can try to touch on all of them, but if I would, as you now know, I have the propensity of speaking a long time. So if I answer all of them, we'll be here till tomorrow. But before answering anything, I find analog computing totally fascinating. Deeply,
thank you.
Yeah, totally. I mean, just think about, right? So in my understanding, almost nothing in nature happens to be digital. DNA is digital. Our brains are probably not very digital. And if you think about how much energy a data center needs as opposed to how much energy our brain needs, then maybe the von Neumann architecture and so on was just an ad hoc solution that was good in the 1940s. But if von Neumann or Turing would have lived longer, then Turing already began thinking about analog computing, basically, right? So they would never have, it's inconceivable for me that they would have stayed on the level of a von Neumann architecture. So building analog computers, especially now, energy scarcity, etc., like is deeply fascinating. The fact that log happens at the same time as Newton, roughly, is correct. So this the shortest possible version of answering that question is up until the 1590s, very roughly, in Europe, only talking about Europe, people thought that they live in a divine nature cosmos. And in this cosmos, nature did not mean what we mean today, like a place of, outside of the city where you go with your children on the weekend and say it was good to be in nature, looking at plants and so on. Nature was a word for metaphysical essences. So like you can say in English, the nature of something. Well, this is in the nature of the thing. So everything had a nature, and that natural thing was basically a divine thought or first principle. And so the way to understand reality was not to do scientific experiments. The way to understand reality was to discover these divine essences, and that was best done by contemplation. So like many at the time, Galilei believed all of that, but Galilei, like many Aristotelians, was interested in movement. Why do things move? And he had this funny idea that he could go and study mechanics in the city of Padua, where he just had become a professor. And Padua had a big harbor, and so he went to the harbor where boats were sort of offloaded and so on, and people had like these little machines where you turn something, a big box gets over. And Galilei studied that for 2 years, and everybody said to him, "You're stupid. Why do you go to the mechanica? They're uneducated, they're dirty, they can't help you solve your problem." He said, let me do. So he drew their machines, and then he invented a mathematical way of describing them. And in honor of the mechanica with whom he worked, he described this new theory as mechanism. So that's where the word mechanism comes from. And so he had this new mathematical formula, and he went from the harbor to calculate the movement of the planets. And it worked. So the fact that you could describe the world in a predictable way in terms derived from instruments made by human mechanics was very confusing, but very beautiful. He felt like, oh my God, I discovered the truth of the cosmos. And so he did not dare. Giordano Bruno had just been burned. He did not dare to publish his stuff, but he wrote it up and gave it to students. Descartes was one of the people who got a copy, and Descartes did the first general theory of reality in terms of mechanism. And so now reality was described by Descartes as just matter, lifeless matter, organized in mechanism. And Descartes at the beginning thought that humans are also just lifeless matter organized in mechanism, but he could, for the life of him, not understand what to do with thought. And that's why he exempted humans from matter. And that's why Locke had the problem that he had. Like it was precisely at the time when nature became matter and humans became more than matter. Like it's sort of the residue of the cosmos, if you will. Whether AI is alive or not, I don't know. So whether it's immortal, like I could say it doesn't have life and therefore it's not immortal because you need to have life in order. But you know, one of the things I find fascinating is in the West, the distinction between living things and non-living things was always known, but it was not always important. Dead things, think of ancestors, fully can have agency. So when did the distinction between life and non-life become important in the West? It was only with Kant that that distinction became a really, really big deal. Only living things have thought. Only living things have creativity. Only living things have individuation. So life became important only at a specific moment in time. And I think AI teaches us that the ontological importance of life is much less strong than we thought. Things don't have to be alive to have understanding, to have intellectual operations, to have agency, and so on. And so basically that's how I think about it. Yeah. I'm sure I forgot 2 questions or 3, but yeah. Thank you so much.
It's fair. Thank you.
Okay, our fourth and last commentator, but not least, is Dr. Zhou Chibo, finally a philosopher from the Department of Philosophy at Peking University. And his research focuses on classical German philosophy, phenomenology, transcendental philosophy, and theories of subjectivity.
German idealism.
Yeah. So thank you very much for your fascinating presentation, and also thank you for the introducing. Yeah, like Dr. Zhang, Professor Zhang had said, my own research area is classical German philosophy. So to be completely honest, I don't really have any background in AI or the philosophy of AI. And if I have learned anything about it, it is basically from today. But after I listened to your talk, I have to say I'm very impressed. Normally, when I hear the question, can AI have consciousness like we do? I find this question philosophically a bit puzzling, to be honest. But to be fair, that reaction comes from some of my own philosophical intuition. To be fair, you have successfully show us that the very idea of our internality is a kind of, let's say, culture achievement or a kind of anthropological phenomenon. And you have also shown us that the idea of our narrative identity is also, it could also be counted as a kind of cultural achievement. But still, I tend to think that the human consciousness has certain dimension that could not be counted as a kind of, let's say, cultural achievement or the anthropological phenomenon, and this dimension could also not be shared by the machine, like our awareness of time, or the experience of sensory qualia, and our immediate self-acquaintance, and our grasp of knowing how the practical knowledge and so on. And that's the reason why I feel the problem a bit puzzling. But however, in your talk, I think you have also inspired me to consider a kind of, let's say, a kind of pragmatic approach. With pragmatic approach, I'm also thinking about Turing's famous paper on whether machine can think. I think it is obvious fact that the current development of AI has already fundamentally blurred the boundary between humans and machines. And so at the very least, we have reason to assume that what we call intelligence in AI requires a new way of understanding and different from how we traditionally understand machine. And perhaps we even need a new concept of consciousness different from our own to describe this kind of intelligence. And I think that's where your that's the direction that you are going to.
Mhm.
And this direction I find very fascinating, because once we accept this, a whole range of philosophical questions opens up. For instance, I think the classical philosophical problem of the relation between our own consciousness and that of others. This kind of questions reflect a kind of anxiety about the fact that we can never truly know what others are thinking. And in fact, a similar philosophical anxiety has also exists regarding AI. So we don't really know what is it thinking. So if we watch the film The Red Eye of Hannah Soren in 2001, A Space Odyssey is just a powerful image of that. And I think your approach shows us a new possibility or a new way to deal with this kind of problem. And I find it very interesting. And finally, I would like to raise two questions for you. The first question is about the autonomy of AI. If we are to say that AI has some form of consciousness, then it seems necessary to consider whether it has autonomy. And given that AI lacks a dimension of a sensory dimension or affective dimension, we might assume that its autonomy, if it has any, would not be the same as human autonomy. And what would you define that if it exists? And the second question is this. So you seem to have a very optimistic view of AI, but there are also many pessimistic view for them. If AI can, in some sense, think, then this very fact might have a negative impact on us. We may become too inclined to let AI think for us and to talk for us, to speak for us, and even eventually we might lose our own distinct, irreducible way of thinking and expressing ourselves. And how would you respond to that concept? And that's my question. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So, I mean, no philosophy school in the world has done more for developing the I, subjectivity, more than the philosophers that you're basically working about. The German idealists, basically, that is. So let me try. So when somebody says, so let's say I say to somebody, AI can think. Of course, AI can think. Very obviously, it's like thinking when you talk to it. And then a humanist, a classical European humanist will say, no. An AI is processing information. Thinking is something completely different. You know, thinking involves deliberation inside the human mind, qualia experiences having a body. AI doesn't have any of this. AI is not thinking. Yeah, I understand that. I think it's sort of a valid response. But I also think, hold on, but as historian of thought, I also know that all the things that you just said that humans do are relatively recent ideas, and we actually don't know if they're true. They're basically ideas that humans tell themselves about themselves, often to feel a little better. So no, I don't want to draw the line between humans and AI in those terms, basically. I don't want to. That would be a form of human exceptionalism, and so I'm uncomfortable with that. Now, there are also people basically who say, oh, of course AI thinks, and it thinks exactly like humans do, like there's no difference what you're thinking. Well, that's going too fast. That's going too fast, right? So I grant AI intellectual operations for sure. I think humans have intellectual operations. I can, in terms of compute, as he just asked, basically say, well, there is like what's compute, basically, right? This, if I can describe it in terms of a mathematical function and the machine can execute it, can compute it, basically, then that's compute. So maybe I can even describe it on that level. Does it make it the same thing? No, it might not be exactly the same thing. So I'm interested in maintaining that difference and distinction. But you see the old defense of the human against the machine, right? Ever since Descartes, There's one other of the human, and that's the machine. And that distinction may no longer help. So just defending the human or thought against the machine is not good enough anymore. But the inverse, saying, oh, and therefore humans and machines are the exact same thing, is a little fast. It's probably also not true. I don't even think that AI is a machine in the classical sense of the term. So yeah, there we're in truly philosophical terrain. So this, the question of autonomy, that always troubles me, because when somebody asks that question, and maybe it's even when you ask that question, it implies that we humans are autonomous. I'm not autonomous at all. I don't determine when I wake up. Most of the day, I don't determine what I'm thinking. If I only could conduct my thought and determine what I'm thinking, that would be so nice. I cannot determine the questions that you're asking. I usually, like you could say, yeah, but you can autonomously think about what you say in response. Is that really true? Is that what we do? Once I start thinking, the words come out and I follow my words much more than my words follow me. So autonomy is such a tricky concept. It's not that we are fully autonomous. We might be, when I say something like this, I run into the same trouble as I just ran into with thinking. Do I mean to say that we're like machines or like AI? No, that's not what I'm trying to say. I'm just trying to say the description of humans as autonomous things is not fully clear to me. Like, I'm not sure that that works. So like, for example, Locke says, I'm the originator of my thoughts. Am I? My thoughts come to me. I'm really sorry. I'm not the originator of my thoughts. Now, you could say, but they come to you inside of you, and that's your mind, and your mind's the originator of your thoughts. I could say, sure, I understand all of that, and yes, good. But I find Aristotle equally plausible. Thought is, and therefore it occurs in me, but it's not reducible to me. So, it's not clear to me. Like, all of this is much more complicated. And so AI systems, I often say, do have an agency of their own. And I actually mean that. What I mean by that is, when they are trained, they learn things, and then they can do things in terms of what they have learned before. Does that involve volition? So I find volition a better term than autonomy. I don't think it involves volition in AI systems, but it can involve volition in humans. Now I'm in a funny terrain where I just defended the human against the machine. So like, these are all terrains where we have no knowledge. And the vast majority of philosophers or humanists I know spend their days defending the human against the machine. This is human, this is machine. Let's redraw this line. Let's redraw this line. I don't think that line can be saved the way that it existed. But the vast majority of engineers don't do much either, because they basically say, oh, well, humans are machines, AI is a machine, and that's that. Everything is mechanism, and that's not helpful for navigating. And also the vast majority of companies build AI to push the automation paradigm into domains where we thought only humans can flourish. And so they keep AI like in a box that says industrial machinery, more efficiency, automation. And so very few people do AI as an experimental philosophy to understand if there is a boundary between humans and AI, how we should articulate this boundary, how we should navigate this. So I think that this is all a field of research for, like you asked me what my comments or my encouragement for philosophy students is now. And the way I often think about this is, we live through an epochal rupture, the one epoch coming to an end and another one beginning. And when you ask yourself, what is an epochal rupture? Then there is only, I've spent so much time thinking about this, and I come up with one answer. And that is, the philosophies that we have lived by become insufficient. There are now things in the world that we can no longer think with the philosophies we already have. So an epochal rupture is very, very much a philosophical event. And we have today in the world knowledge that defies the concepts or philosophies we have, problems, think of climate change and species extinction and so on, that defy the concepts that we have, and possibilities, think of AI or bioengineering, that we cannot think in terms of the philosophies we already have. So very clearly, we live through a philosophical rupture. And what I just tried to do was an expose of the insufficiency of the distinctions that we have made. So So we have to do philosophical research at the intersection of, philosophy and AI or technology or neuroscience, in order to learn how to think better and clearer, redraw the categories that we have. Thank you.
And to continue my question, if consciousness is not mathematic, how should we describe it precisely?
So I don't think consciousness is a thing. So I'm the worst person to ask, right? I think consciousness is a concept, is not a thing. It doesn't exist actually.
So if you cannot describe it or define it precisely, you cannot. It's very difficult to discuss or research about it.
Yeah.
There will be many diversities.
Yeah.
It's only for fun.
Yeah, it was fun from 1694 to 1695.
So now questions are open to everyone in the audience. Since we already only have like about 15 minutes, so keep your questions short if possible.
Thanks for your talk, Professor. Really fascinating, and it's very refreshing to hear an AI talk that has such like historical sensitivity and context. Two thoughts. So first, I have comments on what the ancient Chinese case. So I think I was thinking through it. Did they have a consciousness concept? And I think actually, that your interlocutor is right. And there's nothing like how Locke thought of consciousness, but there are all these there's this rich like mental vocabulary, knowledge and awareness and all these things. So that's interesting just to compare to theirs.
Yeah, it would be super fascinating to actually, so Professor Sun also says, and Professor Zhou and others I've worked with, that's a comparative history of thought project that is funded by the Berggruen Institute, where philosophers from China, Japan, India, and from the West are basically comparing these concepts. And what we do is, so for example, everybody in Indology or in Sanskrit studies translates Atman as consciousness, as if this were obvious. But when you attend to the word much more narrowly and look for what are the conceptual implications that are made by text, you end up with configurations that are quite very, very different from what Locke thought. And we translate Atman as consciousness because the first translations of Sanskrit were by Germans, and they translated Atman as Bewusstsein, which is a very different word from consciousness in some sense. And it's stuck, that's just that. So going and looking at that mental vocabulary and beginning, like when you say mental vocabulary is so fascinating because in Europe, mind was not interior, mind was outside. So to actually look at what are those terms? How do they conceptualize what we call mental activity? Is the mind inside or outside? Do they have words for interiority? What does inside mean? So like there's some people, doesn't matter, but like making that explicit, like the implicit conceptualizations, I think is incredibly important.
Yeah, awesome, thanks. Related to that, very tenuously, I think what we see a lot with these concepts is they start in philosophy with a very specialized meaning, and then that meaning generates the sense widens, right? And I think consciousness is such a case. I think usually in analytic philosophy, when people ask, "Oh, what's going on with consciousness?" or what are the correlates of consciousness, this, whatever, they just mean like phenomenal consciousness or the perceptual awareness, right? And I think that is probably, I would guess that that's true with the people who pipe up at town halls, that when people ask, is AI conscious? More often than not, I would think, just based on my sense of folk usage, they mean, is like an AI having a sense experience.
So I think Nagel is fully reducible to Locke. Like the concept of what it's like is only possible. It's true that he does not explicitly basically say what's the originator of thought or something like that. But the concept of mind and consciousness that he operates with relies basically, I think, on Locke. Because where do you have the experiences of what it's like? Where do a qualia sort of manifest? So the conceptual dependency of Nagel is on Locke. I think in the town halls and so on, it's simply that consciousness stands for awakeness, for being alive, basically. Having interiority.
Last question.
Thank you. Thank you for this precious chance. Since I'm a film producer, and one of my work is Moon Man, headed by Shinteng and Ma Li, and another blockbuster is The Wandering Earth. Right now, I'm sitting here because I'm working on another new science fiction film, and the story is highly related to the AI. But right now, I'm not going to talk about my story. I'm trying to ask a question about the boundary between the AI and the human, because in your talk you mentioned the differences between the machine, the animals, and humans. Because we humans, we have life. But several days before, I read a story. It's not we people, human, we upload our consciousness to the net. It's a story about renting humans' body to the AI. So the AI, the superpower AI in future, they can feel all the real things like humans. So my question is, if this kind of things happen someday, what can we thinking about this kind of things? Can we change the AI's category from the machinism to the human? Can we say AI with, if they can rent a human's body, they have the life? So here's the question. Thank you.
Sure. So I'll give two short answers in the name of time. One is I do not. So the distinction between humans having life and consciousness, animals having life in the form of sentience, and machines not having anything is not mine. Was from John Locke. So he invented this distinction in the 1619, so the 17th century. And I think that most people operate with that distinction today. So just to give you an example, most universities have a faculty of arts or the human or Geisteswissenschaft, which is about humans, things that only humans have, because humans are more than animals or machines. So culture, society, mind, psychology, law, etc., economy. And then you have a faculty of science, which is about nature, living nature. And then you have a faculty of engineering, which is about machines. So these distinctions that were invented in Europe are very, very important. Now, so I think these distinctions no longer work. That's why I sort of described that. Now, you know, I think that you may disagree with me on this, but I think that the risk of uploading a human mind to a computer for the next 20 years only exists in sci-fi, not in the real. We don't even know what a mind is. I'm not even sure we have a mind. I think it's just a conceptualization of humans in a certain way. And so I'm not sure like what the questions or challenges exactly there are. But if we manage to upload a human mind to a computer and the computer becomes equivalent to the human mind, then we also don't have to worry about the computer behaving like a human, because it will be a human mind and it will inevitably behave like a human.
But what if we can rent our body, physical body, to the AI? So the master will be the AI, not the human. How can we define that kind of AI, machine or human? Because they may have lives because they have body, even though they rent it from people.
I suggest you rent your body to AI and then you report back. But more ironically, there is already a movie about this. And the movie is by an artist called Yiwen Zhan. And it's called Life After Bob. Bob is B.O.B, stands for Bag of Beliefs. And the movie is an anime movie. He drew everything, and is about the little girl that had an AI implanted in her brain, and the AI takes over. And at one point she wakes up and so on. That's what the movie is about. So his movie is the best answer I can give to the question.
Yeah, I think maybe we can take one last question. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm curious about your limb.
Lim.
Yeah, can you introduce more about that?
Sure, sure. So for that, I have to like take a big step back, right? So in 2016, the University of Berkeley hired me to build a new research center. And what I wanted to do at Berkeley is pretty much what I described here. The distinction between humans, nature, and technology no longer holds. Fields like the microbiome or AI are experimental philosophical fields. I basically said that the question concerning the human has migrated out of the human sciences into fields that have nothing to do with the human. And we need new forms of disciplines, new forms of research centers. And that didn't work at all. People hated me, like especially in the humanities, and they hated me because when you say that humans are not more than nature, then the humanities lose their legitimacy. Then the life sciences are good enough, you know. And so I was always saying, no, it's the exact opposite. The life sciences become philosophical sciences. They become human sciences. They need you, but nobody that didn't work. So I left. I left the university. I was a university professor at Berkeley. That's like a super high level distinction. You're not owned by a department. It was really bad. I had to leave. After 7 months, I resigned. I felt like the world has outgrown the university, and I wanted to be on the side of the outgrowth. I didn't want to be on the side of the 19th century. I wanted to be there. And so I began working with, you know, microbiome labs and companies and with AI companies, and found that many in the AI field in particular, but also microbiome, have exactly these kinds of philosophical questions and curiosities that drive me. So I got introduced to Nicholas Berggren Institute, and Nicholas asked me what I want to do, and I explained, and he said, that's what I want my institute to be about, come. And so I really got the chance of basically helping him design the place, and we put philosophers and artists in AI companies and so on. And each time we had a new cohort of fellows, young philosophers, anthropologists, sociologists, historians, and artists. I had to introduce them right to the ideas, to which concepts break, what has become possible that wasn't possible before. I'll say the importance of artists was huge, because when we had only young philosophers in an AI lab, you know, like everybody was busy coding, and the philosophers wanted to have conversations, but the engineers had no time for conversations. And so the artists were people basically who could engage the philosophers, but they also built stuff. Artists make things, right, as the engineers. So the artists were an unbelievably beautiful bridge. And so yeah, I began writing little textbooks for these fellows, and I decided that I really want to, I wanted to take revenge on the university. I wanted to build my own university that does the things that the university could not do when I was there. And so I began building a small university called Transformations of the Human. And we had a couple of cohorts, and that was a lot of fun, but it was always only on the level of talking. We talked about AI. We made artworks about AI. We did a lot of projects with companies. That was one way in which we funded the school. A company could call us, and we designed a project, and the students helped me basically do this project. But none of the companies really built what we suggested that they built. And so I went back to the people who gave me money for the university and said, you must give me much more money. I need to build an AI model. And they said, you're crazy. I'm like, no. If you believe in the work that I'm proposing to you, we have to have chips. We have to have AI engineers. We have to prove that one can build models from a philosophical perspective. And they said, no. And I got desperate, and I decided to close the school, because I felt I have to prove that you can build AI from a philosophical perspective. So I closed the school, and I went to VC firms. And VC firms told me that having a philosophical idea is very different from having a business plan. Go home. So they didn't give me money. Eventually, Eric Schmidt, who was once the CEO of Google, gave me a little bit of money. And we built an AI model. And the idea of the AI model is very, very simple. you know, like, let's assume that the human mind has limits, like there are limits of what humans can think, right? So it has like an axiom in a formal system or something like that. And let's assume that AI models can be built to add epistemic spaces to the human mind so that humans can think things that we couldn't think qua human. The easiest example is move 37 in the AlphaGo game, when AlphaGo calculated a move that no human had ever considered before, and that really changed how the game is played. And so we wanted to do that, but it turned out that for building a large language model, you need a lot of money. So we couldn't do that. The only thing we could do was building an image generator. And when you usually build an image generator, you write a prompt and you get 4 images. You don't like it, write another prompt. If you don't like it, you go to Photoshop and you edit the image. And so we built something, a variational autoencoder, very, very simple, on top of a diffusion model. You give the image a drawing or you give the AI an image or a drawing, you can take a photo, and the AI analyzes what we call the creative variation potential implicit in the image. So your init image becomes an output image, which is only slightly different from the init image. The output image automatically becomes the input image, slight variation again, and then you have a loop. And so you have hundreds of frames running by your eye, and it's as if your image becomes alive, basically, alive with its creative potential. And at the beginning, there was just like an experiment with artists. And so one artist we worked a lot with was a French artist called Pierre Hugues. And Pierre was playing with this and said, hey, could I have a pause button and draw in it or erase something? And we're like, oh yeah, that's really easy. And he started like drawing and said, this is really cool. Hit return, let it run. And then he said, you know, I've been going to museums for 30 years and I copy paintings. And I copy paintings because I want to understand the inner logic of a genre so that I can get outside of it. When I'm working with this little app, I get into spaces where I have associations that I never had, and I don't think any human ever had them. Like, keeps on working, says, you know, these images happen otherwise than human images happen. And we got ever more excited, right? And then he says, this really takes me outside of me, but takes me with it. And so we did a lot of projects with artists, and there was a lot of fun, but you cannot earn any money with that, right? So it was not a good business model. And one day I showed what we do to a friend who worked for Louis Vuitton, Moet Hennessy, LVMH. And he said, hey, could you also do this for fashion? Like, yeah, you can do this for whatever. In fact, we by now did a project with Nestle about food design, which is kind of funny, you know. I didn't know that that's actually a job, food designer. But so we did projects with the French Fashion Institute, and first with students, and then with designers from Dior and Louis Vuitton and Celine and Patou and Loro Piana and Loewe and Kenzo and Helios, Jean-Paul Gaultier, Rabanne, and yeah, now LIM's a company, and you know, like most AI companies build image generators so that we can replace human designers. We build an AI model to enable human designers to have creative associations they couldn't have otherwise. So it's very different. And as far as we can tell now, the clothes and especially the sunglasses that are made with LIM sell better than any pair of sunglasses that LVMH ever made, because never had anybody seen those forms. I can show you one of the sunglasses. It's actually yeah. Going? Yeah, I think that was the one I had. Thank you. So here we basically took dresses by Madeleine Vionnet. She was the first, she was the first professional fashion designer in France in the 1920s and 30s, and many of the Charleston dresses, were made by her. So we built a small model, really small model, with a few thousand images that are only of dresses made by her. And the idea is that the AI discovers the logic that organizes her dresses. And then we ask designers to make Madeleine Vionnet dresses that are epistemically authentic Madeleine Vionnet, but Madeleine Vionnet never made them. Now, the first designer we worked with was an eyewear designer, which was really bad because, as you can tell, there is no single eyewear in this model. So how can we ever make eyewear? So we started with an AI. We started with a photo that we found online of an AI of glasses and let it run through LIM. And every frame that you see was an interaction between the eyewear designer and our little model. So it grows and grows and it arrives at this. Now I show you the same thing again, just slower. So basically, yes. So basically the eyewear designer said, well, make the frame golden. Okay, make the frame go away. The model goes to the dresses because it's Madeleine Vionnet. And then the eyewear designer says, no dresses, make it more glasses. But the model always goes back to the dresses and the designer gives in and lets it run. And at one point says, okay, yeah, this could be glasses, put frames on it, put the sidebars on it. Can you bring some of the gold back from Madeleine Vionnet, who's famous for Greek designs and patterns? And so very, very slowly through the interaction with the fashion designer and the AI, you get this. And I literally had never seen sunglasses like that. And the designer said that he has, when he's working with LIM, there are lots of new forms that he had never seen, but 80% of them are terrible. But then he showed me this, so it's very pretty. And you can do this for, like here, somebody from L'Europeana made chairs. Very gradually, this lady becomes part of a chair. And then he experiments. I made that slower so one can see it better with the colors and the shapes and the drapes it. And here, the lamp and the table also is made by this. We did this for thousands of bags. More bags. You can draw in it and make stuff just go away. Here we start with shoes to make, we start with bags to make shoes and so on. But initially, the stuff that we did with LIM was very, very different. This was the first one we ever did, just for ourselves. Pedro had Procreate and drew these flowers on an iPad, took the screenshot and gave it to the AI model, and our AI model LIM did this. And we were just captivated, completely blown away by the idea that the AI really enacts the creative potential implicit in the initial image. And the little, right, it says battery life and carrier, and these instantly become Chinese signs. Now, whether they are actually true or not, I don't know, but it's fascinating. Or here, we gave the AI a little text of Franz Kafka, the whole story of the transformation. And look at how these beetles are basically running. This is with sound, and the sound was also made by AI. So this image is a photo taken by Andrew Zuckerman, and he wanted this to become two flowers. So I just let it run. I think I have one more somewhere. No, that's it. So this is what I showed this friend from LVMH, and he then basically said, let's do this fashion stuff that I walked you through. I think we have one more. Yeah, this, see? Usually creativity and machine are mutually exclusive, but they don't have to be mutually exclusive.
How do they communicate, interact between human and your AI?
So it took us a long time to find out what the right interface is. But when you have normal image models, you start with the prompt. But most actually existing creatives don't start with words. They start with drawings or with images. And turns out that in the fashion world now, drawing is no longer important. It's mostly mood boards and so on. And then they go to the atelier and sort of, try out. So they like to begin with images, and then the images get transformed. Now you want to interact with the images, with the transformed images, as intentional as possible. So you want to control surprise. You want to be surprised, but not radically, like you want to narrow down the surprise. And so you have to do things like, the pause button, being able to erase, being able to add, being able to say, these shoes are good, but look, here's a photo of these shoes. Make the front part more like in that image. So you can upload reference images and so on and so forth. So I think the value of AI is actually not in building the large models, but in building these workflows. But
you still use language like words to communicate?
Oh, with the image model, yeah, I do, because I'm terrible at drawing. But I usually start with an image, and then I use words in addition.
The words, but also can be image.
And this is called lim. Why? Well, because lim is an actual English word. It means to paint a picture with words. So it is, the Latin word illuminare was used in the Middle Ages for the work of monks that drew pictures in Holy Scriptures. So they were illuminating basically these Holy Scriptures. And then in French, that became illuminer. And when the word moved from French to English, illuminer was too long, and so they called limned it. You lim something. And so in British English, the word is still known. In American English, it's very rarely used. And it seemed so appropriate for an image model that is trained on words, basically, to call it lim. Yeah. Thank you.